Welcome everybody to our latest InterMET.digital webinar. This is Dr. Sheldon Drobot, and I'm the Mission Area Lead for Environmental Intelligence and Sustainability at Boulder Aerospace. Our latest webinar is episode 3 of our Climate Change Special Report on the opportunities for addressing the causes and impacts of climate change. Just to recap what's gone before, in episode 1, we looked at the business opportunities associated with technologies used for detecting and monitoring climate change, where we focused on measuring, monitoring, and modeling water and air quality. In our second episode, we examined the current state of science and how the public, private, and academic sectors are working to help meet the challenges to business and society. In this latest episode, our third and for now concluding part of our climate change special report, we will focus on building social and economic resilience to climate change in urban and rural communities. Joining me today are a number of great panelists. First is Dr. Mcloone, who's the Executive Director of ISET International, Ken Mcloone, who's the Climate Change Officer at the Bureau for Development, Democracy, and Innovation, the United States Agency for International Development, Dr. Andreas Mühlbauer, the Associate Vice President and Senior Lead Research Scientist in the Engineering and Research Department of FM Global. And unfortunately, our fourth panelist, Craig Guibert of the Argonne National Lab, is unable to join us immediately, but we hope he will be here for the Q&A. So to start the session and lay the groundwork to drive our discussion and enable you to formulate your questions, each panelist will give a brief presentation. So let me introduce our first expert, Ken Mcloone. Ken, who's based in Boulder, Colorado, is a climate change specialist with the USAID, where he works on the climate and cross-sectoral strategies team. Ken has over 25 years of climate science and action experience, ranging from the development-focused urban climate resilience efforts across 17 cities in the South and Southeast Asia to discoveries and assessments of carbon dioxide and methane trace gases in the atmosphere. Previously, Ken was the CEO of the Institute for Social and Environmental Transition, ISET. And in this presentation, Ken will consider resilience as a means to address uncertainty, particularly through the lens of climate change and urbanization, two issues which are adding uncertainty to planning and human development. So Ken, the floor is yours.
Yes, I'm Ken Mcloone. Thank you, Sheldon. Good day, everyone. I am a climate change specialist with the U.S. Agency for International Development, also known as USAID. Though today I'm not representing the U.S. government. I'm here as a private citizen, which is why I don't mention them in my slide here. My presentation today will be very high level. It's going to look at what I hope to convey here is that many of the tools and sort of mindsets or ways of thinking about sort of the challenge of climate change adaptation, particularly in the urban context, aren't necessarily lined up well with a lot of the challenges. Not all of them, but a lot of them. So first, sort of our typical understanding or how we generally approach the challenge of urban climate adaptation. We often we consider the challenge through climate projections, which show us a general idea of where the climate is going. We then assess the climate impacts, what will be the impacts of those projections, show the vulnerability of what those impacts will be, who will be vulnerable and how. And then we design some adaptation actions. This is a fundamentally linear model of how to understand the impacts of climate change. Here, for example, is our climate change projections from a collection of models using 4 different scenarios. Note already, this is for global temperature. Note already that we have 4 different possible outcomes, providing what I would call some uncertainty already. And this is our most, temperature is our most, we have the most confidence in what the climate projections have to say. So take urban planning. In the urban planning context, you can see that you can understand your city's layout. You could perhaps use a digital elevation model or a green space or measure the green space to understand what climate impacts might be, and then plan for that accordingly. And then given an assessment vulnerability on the impacts, you would then plug that into your governance and planning structures and into policies so that you can then lead to, then adapt to climate change. So this is sort of the linear model of how we go from climate projections to adaptation actions. The challenge is that the world is not linear. The world has a lot of non-linearities to it. Here's that earlier model scenario again, this time with showing the actual variability within each of the model runs. And what's interesting in this case is that often people will go to the mean, they'll go to that middle darker color line and just adjust for that, but that's not true with climate projections. Everything in that sort of fog that surrounds each of the mean curves is a possible future. And so depending on the criticality of what you're trying to address, some of the extremes are should be considered. And also recall that temperature is our most robust climate projection, that if this were a graph of precipitation, or if this were scaled down from the global level to a local level, the uncertainty goes up. Oh, and also, by the way, the historic record shows this from ice cores, that fundamental transformations in the global climate system can happen on the order of about 3 years. Here it shows a transformation from the previous glacial period into the interglacial, the period we live in now. So there are these fundamental shifts or tipping points in the Earth system that could also happen. So there's a lot of non-linearity built into the Earth system. In urbanization, those nice pictures of nice straight roads and everything, but the reality is that people use cities as means of livelihoods and means of meeting their needs. And this isn't just a developing world issue. As you'll see probably later in today, it's an issue that's universal. It's in every country. There are formal and informal uses of urban landscapes, and they need to be considered. Like here's a case where changes in land use, there are multiple different parties involved, there are multiple different, even within a government, multiple different departments and different priorities, working in this case, a river basin, making changes to the river basin that can have impacts upstream, downstream, and to all the different stakeholders involved. And lastly, it's how social networks work, how people actually operate. So this gives an image of implementing a policy that's based on a concept of culture of compliance, where everything, all the directives down this pipe works are logical, independent, and don't overlap or interfere with other sort of policies or calls down the pipe works. But in reality, people operate like this. There are nodes, there are people who are go-to for certain issues. There are conflicting policy calls or overlapping policies that ask you to do different things. So it's a semi-formal or informal network of how people actually operate in a space. So the idea here is to use, here is a graph by Dave Snowden, and it has a Welsh name. So it's Kenneth, the Kenneth framework. And if you're interested in finding out more about the Kenneth framework, I'd recommend looking up Dave Snowden and Kenneth framework. But in general, the space that we're operating in doing urban climate adaptation and resilience is in the space between the complicated and the complex. And that the key message here is that much of our work, much of the work of, when you hire a consultancy, operates in the complicated space. That's where you need an expert who can assess the different possibilities and come up with the best answer. And the general approach is good practice. But many of our challenges, many of our future challenges are in the complex domain. That's one where there is no one right answer, that each time you engage with the system, a different output might come. And it has a lot more to do with probing safe things that, probing different ways of working that are safe to fail, so that you can understand where the system is in that particular moment, and then do operations on that. So primarily, a lot of our work is in the complicated domain, and we'll hear a little bit about that later in today's webinar. And a good chunk of work can be done there. The big challenges, and a lot of where we're being challenged right now, is in the complex domain, and we'll hear some ways to address that as well in the upcoming webinar. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention.
All right, thanks very much, Ken. We'll be definitely returning to some of those great points you've asked and raised later on. But now let me introduce you to our next expert, Dr. Andreas Mühlbauer. Based in Seattle, Andreas is a senior lead research scientist at the Structures and Natural Hazards Research Group at FM Global, one of the world's largest commercial and industrial property insurers. Andreas has been leading and contributing to research aimed at improving the company's worldwide natural hazard mapping capabilities, supporting operations and underwriting with the quantification of natural hazard and climate risks, and helping FM Global clients better understand exposures to natural hazards as part of the company's risk consulting services. Recent research projects included the development of a global freezing map and next generation wind and hail hazard maps. Besides these research efforts, Dr. Mühlbauer was involved in FM Global's white papers on tornadoes and extreme precipitation and flooding in the United States. Prior to joining FM Global, Andreas was a research scientist at the University of Washington in Seattle. He has published numerous peer-reviewed papers in the fields of atmospheric sciences. He's been involved in research projects funded by the National Science Foundation, the U.S. Department of Energy, and NASA, and he has served as a reviewer for scientific journals, the National Science Foundation, and the European Research Council. In his presentation, Andreas will examine two key areas: the key challenges of climate change and the expected impacts on natural hazards that can result in property damage and business interruption. And secondly, the engineering solutions that can help mitigate risk and improve resilience. So Andreas, it is over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Sheldon, for the introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here today and be part of this panel discussion on the topic of resilience. Again, my name is Andreas Mühlbauer. I'm a research scientist with a background in atmospheric and climate science. That is what I did for many years throughout my life. I have now the pleasure to be working with a organization, an insurance company called FM Global, and I'm working then in the research division. So FM Global is a rather atypical insurance company in the sense that we approach risk through a research and engineering perspective instead of the more actuarial approach. We are known to be a company of engineers in the insurance business because a large part of our workforce is made up of scientists and engineers like me. And because we are focused on understanding risks and developing loss prevention solutions, we fundamentally believe that the majority of loss is indeed preventable. So since the topic of this webinar is on opportunities for building resilience, let's take a closer look at some of the challenges of climate change first. So we know that temperatures are increasing and sea levels are rising due to a number of reasons. Firstly, because warmer temperatures lead to losses of ice on land. That adds more water to the world's oceans. Secondly, because temperatures are rising, the volume of that ocean water is expanding. And thirdly, many of the coast layers in particular are affected by what's called land subsidence, which is basically a process that can be in part geological, so that's by nature, but also affected by human activities such as groundwater extractions. So what you can see in this figure is actually you see a lot of arrows. Some of them are green, yellow, and red, and those arrows that are pointing upwards are basically showing locations where sea levels are rising at an accelerated pace. So all the areas that are orange and red are seeing pretty large trends in sea level rise happening already, actually, not just in the future. And some of these areas that are impacted the most are actually, at home for me right now, which is on the east coast of the United States, but also parts of Asia. Another big challenge is tropical cyclone activity around the world. While climate projections suggest that the total number of tropical cyclones is either staying the same or actually decreasing, intense tropical storms, which are the ones that are Cat 4 and 5, are actually becoming more frequent, and they are also carrying more rainfall. So what you see on this chart is basically the changes projected by climate models from the last series of runs from the IPCC AR5 for different ocean basins. But you also see at the bottom center, those are the global changes, and for various variables, basically. The first one is OLTC frequency. It's basically showing what I just said. It's going down on average. But the item number 3, pardon me, 2 and 4 are basically the intensity of the very strong storms, so that the Cat 4 and 5, so those are going up. And we also see that precipitation rates are going up. So events like we had in the United States a few years ago, like Hurricane Harvey, that hit Texas and brought a record amount of 60 inches of rainfall, those are the kind of events that we probably see happening more often. So the combination of stronger storms really with more rainfall and sea level rise at the same time is expected to lead to more incidents of flooding. So how do we become more resilient? Well, it's really a two-step process. Number one is really to understand your exposure, understand your hazards and how they're changing. Number two is to be prepared, adapt, use loss prevention solutions that are known to work. And I'm going to talk about those next. But over the years, because we're an insurance company and losses do happen, we actually learned a whole bunch of things from those, especially from looking at clients who implemented loss recommendations, loss prevention recommendations versus those who didn't. We learned that pretty much every dollar spent on tropical cyclone protection in the United States at least reduces loss exposure by an average of about $100. That's a very attractive and interesting 1 to $100 ratio. So how can we become more resilient? Let's look at flooding, for example. When it comes to flooding, there are really 3 types of approaches. So number 1 is to avoid the water if it's possible, right? Which means you need to stay above the flood elevation. But in this case, it's really critical to understand your exposure. For example, are you in a flood zone or not, right? Is the flood zone a 100-year zone or 500-year zone? And what is the expected level of inundation? The second is protect your building. And shown here is one example, for example, for the deployment of flood barriers that go all around your building. That is one solution. But there's many other solutions depending on the exact scenario and the exact case. You might have a different solution for different circumstances. But the third one is basically also designing for the possibility of a flood, which is basically let the water in, plan for it, and adapt for it. And one example that's shown here is to elevate equipment. That might not, the outcome might still be that you might get water into the building when flooding occurs, but the outcome is basically lower losses because you don't lose necessarily all your equipment and all your valuable products. So let's look about the case of wind, for example. So what can we do in terms of wind resilience? So for wind, it's really all about securing the building envelope. That's very important. So for example, installation of window shutters or bracing dock doors can reduce the risk of wind and also windborne debris to compromise the building envelope in the first place. That's number one. But also it's important to review and properly design for wind loads that can happen in these very strong hurricanes. So make sure your deck is properly designed and fastened, and you have flashing installed. And the third thing is really to take a look at what's happening on the roof itself. Today in commercial real estate and industrial facilities, there's a lot actually happening on roofs. You have HVAC systems, you have a lot of roof mounted equipment, and it can be solar panels, it can be all sorts of things. So make sure those are secured to the roof. They are braced and so on, so they don't themselves become flying objects when a hurricane hits. So here's an example basically of a case study. On the left-hand side, you can see facility that has been basically inundated. They did not really follow any sort of flood mitigation recommendations. You can see a lot of products and machinery being destroyed by the water. On the right-hand side, you can see there's the elevated stage here with some of the equipment basically bundled up and put up. They're not a super super difficult effort, but it made the difference basically between a total disaster and just a distraction, because in that case they still got water in, as I mentioned, but it was a simple cleanup and not a total disaster that kept them down for many weeks. Second case shows basically a scenario from Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. On the left-hand side, you can see it as a little facility on the left-hand side here, which had the roof blown off. Essentially, the roof was not really designed for the Cat 4 and 5 wind speeds that were experienced. On the right-hand side, you can see the difference it makes if you have a roof that is actually properly designed for those wind speeds. And again, the case is also made that you can see in real world scenarios a lot of things happening on the roof itself, HVAC systems, mechanical equipment, all those sorts of things, and they need to be properly installed and braced and secured. So with that, I really have 2 points to make. We know that stronger storms, increasing precipitation, and rising sea levels will worsen flood risk in coastal areas in the future. But loss prevention solutions can help with climate change adaptation and improve resilience. And often these solutions don't have to be complex or complicated. They're quite often rather simple, but they do work. And with that, thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
All right, great stuff, Andreas. I'm sure our audience will have a lot of questions for you. So let's now move on to our third panelist, Dr. Karen Mcloone. Karen is the Executive Director of the Institute for Social and Environmental Transition International, or ISET, and based in Boulder, Colorado. ISET is a US-based nonprofit with expertise in climate change adaptation, resilience, and transformation. The organization works across disciplines spanning the social and physical sciences, scales from the local to the global, and contexts, rural and urban, developing and developed, to support learning and better decision-making in ways that create positive change. ISET is currently a member of the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance, a multi-sectoral partnership focusing on finding practical ways to support communities in developed and developing countries, strengthening their resilience to flood risk. The Alliance operates in more than 250 communities in some of the world's most flood-prone areas. Within the Alliance, ISET is responsible for knowledge integration and learning, drawing on the experiences of our 9 partner organizations and 29 country teams around the globe, and creating annual progress and learning reports to share lessons and best practices globally. In her presentation, Karen will look at the commonalities in resilience needs and thinking that we see across both developing and developed contexts. She also will consider the issue of maintaining enabling environments for businesses. So Karen, please take the microphone.
Thanks, Sheldon. And I'm really glad to be here to talk to folks today. I'm excited about this panel because of the way it's kind of sequenced. So Ken kind of set the stage. Andreas has, I think, very nicely spoken to the simple and the complicated settings of Ken's matrix. And I'm going to really look at the complex and the chaotic, and where we have to think beyond what we can plan for with resilience. So for me, building resilience is about positioning yourself to deal with the unexpected. Otherwise, it's planning and preparedness. And that unexpected can be natural hazards. It can be economic downturns. It could be health issues. We've just come through one of those with the pandemic. It can be poverty. And all of these things are exacerbating the demands on us to be resilient. But whatever the catalyst, the point that for me, resilience really kicks in is where you go from something that is a problem. And we have a lot of problem weather. We're used to heat waves that are not comfortable. We're used to hurricanes that we have to prepare for. But when those exceed our systems, when our systems start breaking, that's when we move into disasters. And the the thinking that I'm going to present today and the examples are informed by work we've been doing as part of the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance on post-event reviews, where we go in after a disaster has occurred somewhere in the world, and we talk to people across sectors and across scales to understand, why did this natural hazard event become a disaster? And what can we learn from this to build more resiliently, to recover more resiliently, so that it perhaps won't be a disaster or won't be as much of a disaster the next time. We've conducted these in South Asia, Latin America, Africa, Western Europe, the US and Canada. We've conducted them looking at floods, hurricanes, tropical depressions, and wildfires. And what's interesting about that work is some of the commonalities. As we conduct these, what we look at in particular is the characteristics of resilience, to understand where resilience is or is not being manifest. I find the characteristics of resilience much more actionable than definitions. Lots of people have a definition of resilience. Lots of people have a framework for resilience. For me, what enables me to actually dig in and operationalize resilience is these characteristics. This is the set that's taken from the 100 Resilient Cities work. Flexible, so you can change, adapt, evolve. Resourceful, that you can mobilize and adaptively use resources. Inclusive, that things are equitable, transparent and open. Integrated, connected and mutual support. This is super important. This is the working across sectors. Robust, well constructed and managed. Many people think of robust as well constructed. Well managed, well maintained is absolutely critical, as is safe failure. What happens when it doesn't work anymore? Redundant, that there are backups, but also that there are co-benefits, and able to learn. And this is the piece that we've been adding with these post-event reviews. What can we learn? And in using these characteristics, I've used these with local governments, with county governments, with state governments to actually operationalize resilience thinking. And so I find them quite powerful. And if this is the one takeaway that people get from my presentation, carry it off. It's useful. So in the studies we've conducted around the world, the commonalities that we see, first and foremost, are that we are continuing to build in risk. We need to get much better at critically assessing where we're building, where we're living, and how we're incentivizing risk. Until we get ahead of that, all we're doing is clean up on the stuff we already have while we're building new risk somewhere else. But we also need to recognize that we're not going to totally avoid risk. There is nowhere on the planet that is risk-free. And so as we interact with our environment, how do we adapt to the risk that is there? Which means understanding it. It means then the people that develop that understanding need to communicate it. And the people that it's communicated to need to know what they can do about it. As part of that thinking about how we live in environments that are inherently at risk, we need to recognize that infrastructure only works to its design threshold at best. That's if it is designed well, it's built well, it's maintained well, and all of our calculations that went into that design were correct. And what we see when we go in post-disaster is that there have been failures, either because design thresholds were exceeded and everyone forgot that someone had to make a decision in coming up with the design thresholds that, okay, this is so unlikely that we're not going to worry about it. But there's still that residual risk there. So you need to know that it's still there, or because things failed below their design threshold, typically because they weren't maintained. And so as we think about our intensifying risk landscape, Above all, we need to imagine how bad things could be, and we need to plan for worse. That doesn't mean we need to build for worse, but it means we need to be aware that it could be worse and know what will happen if it is. And in particular, as we think about that, but what if it's worse? I think we need to be thinking about graceful failure. That events become disasters because of failure. And those can be planning failures, regulatory framework failures, maintenance failures, structural failure, communication failure, failure to anticipate and work with change, failure to recognize that something as big as whatever just happened could happen. And we need to plan for these. We need to recognize the different ways that people use infrastructure and services. We need to recognize what happens if those are suddenly yanked out from under them. And we need to come up with new, flexible, emergent, sometimes novel ways, to use words, sorry about my cat, to use words from Ken's matrix. I was going to put them outside. I forgot. To use words from Ken's matrix, the emergent and the novel are a lot of what we see in these studies. And it's where we need to really double down if, as societies, we want to be resilient. So now I'm going to just run through a couple of quick and interesting failures that I think provide very specific lessons, and then I'll conclude. So the first is in Boulder, Colorado, where I live, in 2013, we had a 5-day rainfall event that was characterized as a 1 in 1,000 year event. And the town of Boulder is right at the foot of the Rocky Mountains. And many of the bedroom communities serving Boulder and the other towns on the plains are accessed by 7 roads that run from the plains up into the mountain communities. 6 of those are along mountain creeks, and we lost all 6 of those mountain creek roads because they were completely torn apart, as you can see in this photo. The one road that survived was along ridgetops. And we were just fortunate to have that. There were a number of people whose homes were not damaged, but they were forced to move because they couldn't access work. They couldn't get to and from in a reasonable amount of time for a number of weeks until the roads were patched. And even then they were delayed for probably the better part of a year or a year and a half. So for me, the take-home message here is, as you think about the redundancy in your system, we had 7 roads. That should be plenty, right? Except that the failure modality for 6 of those roads was the same, and that was the failure modality that was triggered. So the redundancy won't help if the same impact will take everything down at the same time. Another interesting failure is the Addicts and Barker Reservoirs in Houston. Downtown Houston, if you look at the top left photo, downtown Houston is just off to the right. These reservoirs were put in, I believe, in the 1950s when this area was cow pastures. And they just built large earthen levees along the eastern and southern edges of this land so that floodwaters could be retained in the case of massive flooding. And then the city grew up and the development expanded, and there's now substantial development well to the west of these reservoirs. And in the process of development, people forgot, even though it was marked on maps, that this land was reserved for flood control reservoir. No one remembered that. These reservoirs currently, if you go visit them today, are beautiful. They're parks, they're playing fields, there's a little zoo in the Addicts Reservoir. And along the western edge of these now, there's development. Because developers said, well, why can't we develop on this land? Texas prioritizes individual landowner rights. No one felt like the notes on the maps really were something they needed to take responsibility for. And so in Hurricane Harvey, for the first time ever since they'd been built, both of these reservoirs filled to capacity. And 9,000 homes and businesses and gas stations and light industrial shops and all kinds of things that you don't want in your floodwater were flooded. And it took several days for these to fill. And there was no early warning system to alert the people and the businesses in the reservoirs that this was happening. So people lost movable assets. Which to me, sort of illustrates the fact that climate change solutions that don't also take into account the regulatory framework needed to make them work, the human behavior and how your solution can be misused, the required maintenance, and a clear plan for who will do it and how it will be paid for. And I would note that at Addicts and Barker, part of why they filled to capacity is because the dams and the outlet works had not been well maintained, and so they could not release water faster. Had it even been possible in terms of the downstream impacts, they couldn't do it. They were afraid of losing the outlet works. And a clear understanding for the limitations of the solutions and plans for what happened when they fail. And in the Addicts and Barker, for example, that would have meant having an early warning system, having an awareness that they had built in their flood control reservoirs. They didn't know that until the water started building up. So I would say that without these, you don't actually have solutions. You just have things that will become your next disaster. And so overall, my take home is that as we move from the simple and the complicated, where we can use best practice or good practice, to the complex and the chaotic, where we need to be thinking about emergent and novel, we need to move from that traditional linear to a much more systems thinking, and it's quite tangled. And then I'm going to riff for just 1 minute on, so what does this mean for businesses? Andreas has done a beautiful job of presenting what businesses can do, often very inexpensively, to address and build in resilience at the facility scale. But increasingly, we're seeing that at the community scale, at the city scale, there are also impacts that then can substantially negatively impact businesses. Businesses need to think about not only what they need on site, but what they need in terms of an enabling environment if they're to survive. And that means their workers need to be able to live somewhere safely. That if your workers' homes are flooded, they're probably not going to show up. You need roads that allow you to access your facility, and so supply chains can get in and out. You need suppliers who can continue to operate and get the supplies in and out. You need communication systems and power in order to support your business. And if you are not situated in an environment that is thinking about all of those, you're at risk. And so that's where I think businesses can do a lot for themselves, but they also need increasingly to be pressuring government to think about and build in resilience as well. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Karen. Great example of graceful failure there as well with your cat. That was a perfect timing for that slide, I think. So, all right. Well, a great set of presentations for sure. We're going to now move to the second part of our webinar, which is our audience and panel Q&A. So let me remind everybody, please ask us questions. My challenge for all the attendees is to ask at least one question. Make use of the Q&A box at the bottom. Don't use the chat window. I'll be monitoring the Q&A and passing on the questions to our panelists. So I see a couple popping in there already. We had a couple of questions come in from people in the audience before the actual event started. So that's where we're going to start with some of our questions. And my first one is for Andreas. So with climate change unfolding, what do you think are some of the more common climate risks we all should be watching out for in the future?
Yeah, thank you, Sheldon. That's a very good question, and there's a lot of perils out there that can do great harm. We know that, and flood, for example, is one of them that traditionally has always been very high on the list of everyone's mind when it comes to damage and impact on economies. So what we see from climate models is kind of a pattern of reinforcing, self-reinforcing trends. We have areas that are already wet, like in Southeast Asia, that are becoming more wet, in fact, right? And the problem with more wetness and more rain is, of course, even more flooding, which is a bad thing. On the flip side, we have areas that are already dry, like Southern Europe, for example, and the trends in the climate models are actually, again, reinforcing. So you see more drought and prolonged drought. And we've just seen the terrible wildfires in Portugal and Spain. And those are the things that you can get with extended droughts, impacts on wildfires, more severe wildfires, but also more generally negative impacts mostly on water resources in general.
All right, fantastic. Let's go on to Karen. And I think this is a bit of a philosophical question, but it makes a lot of sense. So look, global commonalities in resilience are great in concept, but surely there are significant differences or much greater community resilience in developed contexts. Is that a fair assessment? Tell us more.
It's an interesting question. We like to think that. We like to think that we've built our way out of risk, that we've analyzed and modeled our way out of risk. But what we see is that's not always true. One of the most recent post-event studies we did was we just released a study on the floods in Germany from last summer, where, I'm not going to get the number right, over 200 people died from an event that was forecast because early warning systems didn't work, because people weren't alerted, because people didn't understand that these floods were actually going to be worse than the floods they'd had in 2016. That death toll is right up there with, say, the death toll from the absolutely massive flooding that the entire country of Vietnam had 2 summers ago in Germany. So this idea that somehow we're necessarily more resilient because we're in higher developed contexts, I think is starting to fail. And instead of assuming that we're safe, we should be learning from these disasters everywhere to understand how, particularly in developing contexts, there may be less, the systems may be weaker, the infrastructure may be weaker, but the human capital is much, often much stronger, the personal networks and the people helping people.
Yeah, I totally agree. So I have an example from Alaska as well, right? Not so much developing, but kind of Western versus traditional societies. So historically, a lot of the communities would move with the caribou herds, various other things. And so it was very easy for them to move their infrastructure. And then Western society influence came along. They started putting in things in the ground, and then climate change happens. And suddenly now these towns are in much greater duress because they're developed than they would have been. So really kind of interesting parallels that we need to think about. So, all right, good stuff. All right, Andreas, back to you. Here's a bit of a data question for you. So from the audience, we say that, all right, your data with FM Global finds that for every $1 spent on tropical cyclone protection, we see a benefit of $105. Okay. Now, obviously a ratio of 1 to 105. So the audience member has heard ratios as high as 1 to 15, maybe 1 to 20, but never 1 to 105. So can you explain a little bit of how that number came to be? Is that some of your own research, or is that coming from other peer-reviewed publications? Take it away.
No, this is our own loss experience, basically looking at flooding and wind impacts over the years, right? And as Karen mentioned, one thing is very important is to kind of learn the lessons from disasters, right? We all understand, what are the things that didn't work in the past, and learn from this and adapt. So all of this is an evolution, and it came out of an evolution that over time you learn the things that work and the things that didn't, right? When we started this out, I don't think our ratios were 1 to 100, right? There might have been more like 1 to 10, as mentioned here, right? But again, over the time, and we spend a lot of time actually thinking about what are solutions, and we test them, right? When do they work? When do they fail? And all these things, you start to evolve, and you really start to pick out the solutions that make most sense for the circumstances some of our clients are facing. And this is where you start becoming better.
Okay, great, thanks. Now we have a question from Paul Halton. I'm going to translate it a little bit. So Paul's asking or saying planners need to think in decades and plan for the centuries ahead. What will bring politicians and planners together to fund massive investment required to strengthen infrastructure? I want to alter it a little bit, not just the politicians, right? So in the business world, of course, I think you probably see this, Andreas, a lot, right? That we're looking at things like NPV, EVA, et cetera. Those are on 3 to 5 year timelines. Maybe they go out a little bit longer, but certainly they're not on 30-year timelines. Clearly politicians aren't there as well. And I've heard you both talking a lot about the need to plan for the long term and various other things. So how do we bridge that gap? I'd like you both, because I think you have different perspectives to answer that. So,
Yeah.
Andreas, you're on my screen, so go ahead.
I can maybe start with it. I mean, a lot of what we do these days is basically looking at the code, right? And we always build to code. But one thing I really just want to mention here is that building to code is great, but building to code also means you're just really meeting minimum requirements, right? Plus maybe a little bit of safety factors. And all of this is typically designed with having human safety in mind, not necessarily the safety of the structure, right? So typically, I think what we should be moving towards to is really building to last and not necessarily just building to code, right? And I think that will make the difference.
Great, Karen, how would you answer that one?
I'm going to answer it very differently. So I'm working with folks in the Zurich insurance company. I'm working, they are responsive to businesses that are their clients. We're working with communities. We're working with governments. And what I see is every single one of those is waiting for someone else to provide the energy to do something about climate change. The governments are sort of saying, well, at some point, surely insurance companies are going to just, lay down the law and this is going to become uninsurable unless you do something else. And insurance companies, just a couple of years ago, Zurich Insurance Company in North America was still saying, well, we can't talk about climate change because our businesses don't believe in climate change and we don't want to alienate anyone. They've since shifted, thank heavens. But we see politicians still talking about climate change not being real. Until everyone takes responsibility in their own sector to take this seriously and to start pushing for change, everyone else is going to just sit back and watch for someone else to do it.
So Karen, do you think everybody needs to come together, or can there be sectors that take leadership and then bring other people along? Like how do we do this operationally?
So there's a fantastic video that you can Google, which is first follower, the concept of a first follower. Leadership is important. Someone needs to step out and lead, but what is equally important is when someone does that, people need to jump in and have their back. And so we're going to need both. We're going to need people to take leadership, and then we need other people to just pile in, with a lot of momentum and energy and passion if we're going to make change happen. And I think anyone can lead, and I think anyone can be that tier of first followers, but someone has to do it. And NGOs have been trying, and we're too small.
Right. Can you tell me even on a small scale, any actual examples that either like to what we're talking about today, or not even what we're talking about today, just to give the audience members a sense of this is how this has worked in reality?
So Boulder County had massive wildfires this past December. We lost 1,000 homes on the plains in a grass fire. It was a grass fire with 100-mile-an-hour winds, I grant you, but it was a grass fire. We should be able to build in what we know is a fire-prone environment to withstand a grass fire. And what's happening now in reconstruction and in recovery is the county has already said, okay, all of our wildfire regs that we'd been using in the mountains, which is where we thought the wildfire risk was, we're applying them on the plains now. You know, and so immediately there was a government response, but there's also a society response. You know, the community here knows the fire risk. Everyone saw that as a wake-up call. No one saw that as, oh boy, that was weird, that'll never happen again. I think everyone is saying, oh man, is that going to happen again this year? And so you get a different response from that.
Yeah, great. Okay, thank you. All right, now we have a question from Chris Zarzar. Great name, Chris. And this is from Andreas. And I've seen this in kind of my work as well, that there are, I think, a group of people out there that are, let's call them technologists, that think we can sort of technologically get our way out of all these disasters. So Andreas, question for you is, as these novel weather sensor systems are being deployed, how can we work with those groups really to make sure that we configure these systems and the data they're giving us to best support resiliency in smart cities, first of all, but also, let's say, in other areas that aren't quite so smart yet?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I mean, having more information and more data that ultimately comes from sensors is very important, right? We still, when it comes down to weather and climate, we're in a situation where we're not, you know, we still always want to have more data to kind of, you know, get a better picture, because often, like, spatially information is missing in areas that are underdeveloped, right, and in rural areas. So that's certainly something that can help, can always help. But when it's about resiliency and about planning, I think we need a long-term strategy. So I think the short-term, quick technological solutions cannot necessarily help with this in the long term. However, I think they can work and help with warning systems, for example, right? Improving forecasts, hurricane forecasts are often ones that are not accurate, right? Even a few days out. And that often leads to the fact that, you know, you post a warning, right? This city is going to get impacted, and maybe the hurricane changes its track 2 days ahead. And then the community just prepares it. Okay, well, maybe next time I'm not going to be so prepared anymore because I don't believe the forecast. So there's this problem that we have, that sometimes, you know, warnings go out, but, you know, they're not often accurate, and then people are just being caught off and started not preparing well enough, right? So there's certainly places where this can work and can work better for example, tropical storm prediction, but also things like hail, right? And I think we're already starting to see this, that insurance companies, for example, send you a text message, you know, put your car into the garage or something like this to get, you know, not leave it out in the hailstorm and things like that. So there's definitely applications when it comes to weather forecasting and predicting, allowing people to kind of be prepared and do whatever they can. But I think for long-term planning and resilience building, I think we need more than that.
All right, thanks, Andreas. Karen, I have a similar question for you. And I think I'm referring back to your one slide where you had the linear and then the systems kind of approaches. And for sure, kind of in my initial stages of education in the weather community, there was this concept that we push a warning out, people make correct decisions, we save lives. It's become very clear, and Andreas has just said the same thing, that's not totally how it works. So I'm curious, in your experience, how you think some better technology could help in the systems approach to help our communities, our people make better informed decisions. Is it a focus on the technology, the weather forecasting, the climate models? Is it the telecommunications we need to do better? Is it some kind of social fabric we need to improve a little bit more? Is it all of them?
The place I would start is the social fabric. Every single post-disaster study we've done, there have been failures in early warning, because first you need to know what the conditions are going to be. You need to know what the impact of those conditions are going to be. And then you need to communicate that in a way that people understand and are prepared to act on. People then need to take a decision to act, and then they need the capacity and the resources to act. And those bottom three of actually getting messages to people in ways that they can use so that the language isn't too technical. It's in a language they understand. It's from a source they trust. Having them know enough about what that means that they are willing to actually act and that they have the resources to act. Those are a big challenge everywhere in the world. The piece about going from the forecast to what that means in terms of impacts is a big one, and that's where technology can help. Much of that technology in the developed worlds we have. So if there is a dam failure, where will the water be? We don't tend to model that. And that's the kind of thing you want to know before that dam starts failing. We do it for big Class A dams, but we don't do it for little dams. And so we've seen places where there have been, some little tiny dam fails, and then it takes out the one beyond, next one down, the next one down, and the next one down. And a huge number of homes are impacted, and people are, on second floor windows wondering how the heck to get out of their house. And these are things we're never going to have modeled. We can't really predict our way out of them. And so that's where the emergent response is required.
I think that's one of the best takeaways we'll get from the webinar today, and certainly all of them in our climate change series, is that we can't just orchestrate our way out of this with technology, right? I think that's a great message for everybody to take home. And Andreas, a bit of a different question for you here, but I think there's some similarities to the social fabric. And I think what the question is really getting at is that in certain parts of the world, building standards may, for all kinds of reasons, costs, they say, et cetera. I'm going to add corruption in there. We see that a lot in some places. So how relevant is your approach in these other countries where there are let's call them things going on that may be more complicated than in some of the other countries that we're more used to working in?
Yeah, of course, that's a good question. I mean, I would say fundamentally approach doesn't depend necessarily on what a country is doing with implementing codes and standards, right? The approach is understand the risk that you have, the hazards and how they're changing, that's independent. You can do this anywhere, right? And some of the solutions that we have for loss preventions, they also work everywhere, around the world. Of course, we also get involved and have communications and dialogues with international organizations who basically do as the daily bread and butter codes and standard developments, right? And from the experience that we have with dealing with losses and loss prevention solutions, we can step up and clearly tell them what are the things that work and the things that don't work, right? And also see how we can change the standards in the future to make them better. But of course, again, we all want better standards, of course, but also just, as I said before, just building to standard most of the time doesn't quite do it, because standard just means minimum requirement. We want to do more than that.
All right, great. Thanks, Andreas. Karen, I want to kind of play off that question a little bit in that answer. And we're talking about sort of businesses working with communities to create standards, and we want to go higher and all that. But it isn't really enabling the community context the job of society and government, not so much the private sector?
Given the money that is now held by private sector, no. And we used, in the US, when Ford started his company, one of the founding principles of his work was that all of his workers should be able to buy a Ford. Is that true of Tesla today? Is that true of Walmart? I think we had a country in the US and many countries in the world that had very strong ideals, and those have been eroded. If the money is in the hands of the private sector needs to take some responsibility for this, because they're the ones who will lose if communities and cities start falling apart because no one can do this.
I'm in complete agreement with that. And I think we're starting to see even some shareholders and people on boards sort of say these things to companies, right? And that's probably how we'll get some change here. So great answer. So And now let me build off that one back to Andreas and ask a question. Really, there's two things that I want to modify the question a little bit. So the initial question is, what steps can we take as a community to mitigate risks? And I want to take it one step further and say, how about all of us here on the panel and all of the audience members, what can we do as individuals to help mitigate risks? Because I think I find sometimes people think like the problem is so big, so complicated, doesn't matter what I do. And I fear like we don't want that to be the way these things go.
Yeah, that's right. I think, on the big picture, on the community level, okay, I think we need to get back to the root causes of the problem, right? When it comes to climate change, it's our impact on the environment, it's greenhouse gases, right? But of course, addressing those is difficult, and we see this in the news every day, right? It's not something that we can do overnight. So at the same time, it's also true that we have to take an honest look at our exposures, right? It's really nice to be close to the water because you have the views and you can jump into the ocean. But these are the areas that are just prone to be affected by a hurricane and by coastal flooding. Same with wildland fires, right? A lot of development happens in areas that there used to be forests, used to be nature. It's nice to live there, right? But it's also, these are the areas that are impacted by wildfires the most, and where we see the largest losses happening. So it's those two sides, right? And everyone makes their choices, right? So we have to make sure that we make the right choices in this regard when it comes to exposure.
All right, thanks, Andreas. Welcome back, Ken. We've had a lot of great discussions here about how we make effective responses. And we've got a question from the audience that is very straightforward, but I think deserves an answer. And I'll send it to you, Ken. Why can't we just plan out accordingly? We've got climate projections. You showed them to us. Why don't we take the extreme bounds and plan for that, call it a day?
Well, I mean, I guess you could take the extreme bounds, but even those extreme bounds have uncertainty involved with them, particularly when you start downscaling them. So what I showed was the global average annual temperature, which is the most robust of all of our climate variables, right? So and even within that scope, there's a great deal of variability from one extreme to another. So maybe with the most absolute critical infrastructure, you can take the worst case scenario, or maybe the best case scenario, depending on what you're looking at, and build to that. Can be quite costly. But if you consider something like if you're building berms to prevent flooding, it might actually, in a very narrow sense, you might actually exacerbate other issues. So it's about integrating more of both the social and environmental aspects and understanding it in a more holistic way that can help potentially find other avenues that also enhance and build resilience.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I think, okay. Ken, yeah, great. Now, Andreas, I want to build off that a little bit. So Ken's, I think, talking about the importance of powerful groups to make change in some ways. And what do you think about the investment community, in particular, institutional investors such as pension and life insurance funds? These folks have a lot of sway, right? What should they be saying or doing to help build resilience?
So I think that's a very good point. And I think that the very first step, I guess, for them is really to factor resilience into their investment equation, right? And in order to do this, you need to have awareness. And in order to get awareness, you need reporting. And this is something that we see coming in some countries, and I think maybe also in the United States, is basically frameworks that use existing reporting, financial reporting and disclosures about impacts, right? For resilience, for example, on climate resilience and things like this. How is the investment that you fund holding up if a storm hits, for example? So this traditionally didn't used to be any sort of consideration, but I think things are changing, and I think that's the right step.
All right, perfect. So Ken, I want to send, I think, what may be our last question back to you. We've had a lot of great discussion around the importance of systems work and how we've got to blend technology in the social fabric. And it all sounds wonderful. But tell me, how difficult is it going to be to do this systems-oriented resilience work?
Well, it is different, right? So it requires a different set of skills, a different set of tools, and a different, for lack of a better term, I'll say mindset, and not just personal mindset, but organizational mindset. And that is like it's much more about looking holistically and systemically. The indicators, like at USAID, where I work, it's a really big challenge. How do we take a sort of mechanistic view and the very specific indicator of change type of structure that we're used to, sort of scientific management, and how do we transform that into an understanding of how a more emergent indicators, or how you're operating in systems where you're operating in this corner and you get the change in a different part of the system. That's still a positive, pro-resilient change. So I think it's requiring new lenses and new approaches and new tools. And it also requires engagement, more engagement with communities, and a different sense of the role of science in decision-making that's a little less top-down, a little less directive, and more as one piece of information at the table.
Yeah, that's good. That makes a lot of sense to me. We do have a late-breaking question here, Ken, and I'm going to again kick to you, but maybe have some comments from the other panelists as well. So question, recent research from Imperial College and Exeter University in the UK calls on the IPCC to dedicate a future report to catastrophic climate change rather than focus only on less worse scenarios. Their argument goes that catastrophic impacts could take place even at modest levels of global warming. So to what extent do you think this could impact current resilience planning?
I mean, yeah, tipping points, catastrophic climate change are real. That one slide I showed shows that it happened in the historic record. Our climate projections can't reproduce it because well, they can't reproduce them, at least at the moment, the last I heard. And so it's a bit of an unknown. There are a number of tipping elements in the Earth system. Probably the most concerning is the monsoon. For me, there's also Brazil, a number of others. But how might that impact resilience? I think resilience is probably the lens to use. You know, how can we address something that is completely unexpected? We certainly can't plan for it. And so if that sort of change happens, to have the capacities, the networks, all the skills that resilience aims to build is an avenue to help address it. Do others on the panel have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I want to bring that up with Andreas, because at FM Global, part of your job really is to plan for resilience in disasters. How do you guys think about tipping points where there's system changes and what we thought was the way things work don't work that way anymore?
Yeah, so I think fundamentally, again, like understanding what the hazards are is very crucial. And of course, we don't know everything, right? There's always going to be an element of change that can be totally unexpected. But you know, when you understand the hazards, you also understand the range of certainty or uncertainty, right? So, and we know today that, you know, we're in a flood zone. Let's say it's 100-year, right? But we know that this doesn't really take into account the climate change. And one recommendations probably should be, don't build just for the 100-year, right? Maybe build for the 500-year, because you know that your 100-year now is not going to be the 100-year in the future, but maybe only be a 30-year or 50-year, right? So, you know, having this mindset, not just taking the building code at face value, but basically thinking ahead, you know, how is that underlying peril changing over time, and how might that impact my return levels or my ability to be resilient? I think that's key.
Yeah, great, Karen. To kind of build off that, how have you seen in your experience this issue of tipping points? And I'm really curious to know to what extent it's on people's radars that systems aren't linear. It goes back again to the one chart you had that had all the arrows going everywhere, right? That's not just related to resilience. That can be the climate too. And is that kind of coming clear in the discussions you have with people, or is it an area perhaps we need to focus more on?
So a piece of work that ISET has done, funded by NOAA, was on climate thresholds and the point at which weather events move from a challenge to a problem for communities. And we've done that in a couple places in the world, including 4 different communities in the US and some work in India. And what we've seen is that, particularly in developed contexts, weather becomes a problem at like the 98th or 99th or 99.5th percentile. The climate models don't talk about that. Like, what we know from the climate projections is that we're going to get more events in the tails. The tails are getting bigger. And the other thing we know is that it's those super extreme tails that are really the problems for us. And so are we going to see more really problematic weather? Yes. Do we have any idea what it is? No. And so that's where we really need the resilience piece.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, now I think a subtly related question, but a little bit different, and this builds into some of the discussions you already had. Andreas, I'm going to pass this over to you at least first. So we've already talked kind of about Karen talked about the important role that the private sector needs to play. We've talked a little bit about the investment community, but what about financial regulators, Andreas? And I think in some ways the question coming from the audience here is perhaps relating back to a decade and a little bit ago where we had the housing bubble and the crash, right? Is there a role that the financial regulators should have here, given that they impose these rules on investors and banks, such as solvency regulations, stress tests, that sort of thing? Are they adequately paying attention to the risks of climate?
Yeah, I think this is absolutely an important aspect of it, right? Again, it comes back to understanding what really the exposures and the impacts are, and part of this is making sure everyone understands that, and there's transparency also in communication, right? From an investor to like a company. So I think with some of the developments that we have around TCFD, Task Force for Financial Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, this goes in the right direction because it, for the first time, really takes into account the climate impact and climate resilience piece and asks the right questions. So really having this disclosure, I think, is the right step.
Okay, great. Now, in the interest of time, I am going to make this the last question. It comes from James Jensen, and we'll start by directing it to Ken. And it says, how do you see future progress with resilience building? And the second part, are governments and businesses spending enough now, or do they need to spend more? And I think probably the answer is they should spend more. But again, there's only so much money, right? So maybe the right question we're trying to get at is, how do we spend more efficiently to be more resilient?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like my background, having been in climate science, is the answer is always, we need more climate science. So yeah, we need more financing. But I think the difference is quite ginormous, to use a word, which is, I think there's something like $80 billion being invested annually or something. I'm making these numbers up, but it's roughly in this ballpark, and there's trillions needed. And so there's a very large gap. So yes, there actually a lot more climate finance is needed. And it's not just, oh, and isn't that nice? It would be nice to have it. It's vital. In terms of sort of efficiency and understanding where to put it, systems thinking actually provides some avenues to look at the different variables or the different parts of a system and trying to identify the leverage points and so the idea would be then to identify the system, identify its leverage points, and what are the highest value leverage point in that system. This is based on work from Donnell and Meadows, so there's more detail there if you want to go into that.
Okay, thanks, Ken. Well, thanks everybody, all the panelists, all the attendees. This is going to conclude today's webinar, which has been organized by InterMET.digital. Again, I'd like to thank our panelists and you, the audience, for taking the time to join us today. We hope you've gained some useful insights into resilience building in urban and rural communities. If you have any more questions you'd like to ask the panelists, please contact our producer, Ian Harper. His contact information will be on the screen shortly. Also like to point out, a recording of this webinar will be available in the near future. and we'll notify all those registered for today's event. So looking ahead to our next webinar, this will be a detailed look at the applications of sub-seasonal weather forecasts in Asia. And the chair will be my colleague, Jan Dutton, the CEO of Prescient Weather, and it will take place on September 22nd. So stay tuned to the websites for details. But to conclude today's proceedings, it's goodbye from our panelists, Karen, Andreas, and Ken, and from me, Sheldon. To play us out, here's our contact information. Goodbye for now. We look forward to seeing you at our next InterMET.digital webinar.